The World of Adventure by Cassell and Company, published in 1899, contained the story of the Vicar of Mullyon, a man who had been active in the story of the wreck of the Jonkheer Meester van de Wal van Puttershoek. Quote, "The wind swept right up from the sea, scarcely more than half a mile distant from the vicarage, and its shriek in the trees outside, together with the thundering of the surf upon the shore, were all the sounds his ear could catch. If another sound commingled with the din, it was effectually drowned. Nor could anything be seen, no blue light, no rocket, nor any signal of distress, only black darkness. The cry, if cry it had been, was not repeated."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? Mystery of the Jonkheer Meester van de Wal van Puttershoek.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Jonkheer Meester van de Wal van Puttershoek was a 650-ton ship, though few other details were given about her, other than that her nationality was Dutch, and that her home port was Dordrecht. She had departed from Batavia, bound for Rotterdam, on the 25th of November 1866. On board, she had a cargo of coffee, sugar, and spices, with a cargo of tin acting as a ballast for the ship. Her crew, including a first and second mate, numbered 23, under the command of Captain Klaas van Lammerts. She also had on board 6 passengers of various nationalities as she departed from Batavia. Out of everyone on board, the person who would gain the most attention later was a sailor of Greek origin who had joined the ship in October of 1866 while she was in Batavia. Just like the ship he joined, very little would be known about him other than that his name was Giorgio Buffoni. In addition to the crew, the ship also carried 6 passengers, 3 women, 2 men, and a boy. Whether the boy was related to anyone on board of the ship, or if he was traveling alone, was also never clarified. By the time the ship had spotted the Lizard, the number of people on the ship had fluctuated. 2 of the sailors had not survived the voyage, and a third had been left on St. Helena due to being ill. These sailors were not replaced. One of the female passengers had also given birth to a baby on board the ship during the voyage. It was later said that the woman who gave birth was the captain's wife, or a mistress passing as a wife on board the ship. As with many aspects of the story, the details were frequently not agreed on, and part of the speculation may have been due to the fact that while the captain was Dutch, his possible wife was said to have been French. 3 weeks after the captain had welcomed his baby on board, at 6 in the morning on the 25th of March, the Lizard was spotted. The weather was not in favor of the Meester van de Wal, as the English press decided to call the ship. The ship entered Mount Bay at around 7 in the morning, and began to try to make her way across the bay, but a gale had blown in. Her progress was seen several times by locals in the area. The pilots at Mousehole saw her in the afternoon on the 25th, and thought she would have trouble navigating around the Lizard, as there was a strong wind from the southwest. However, since the ship did not send any distress signals or request their assistance, they did not approach her. Later in the afternoon, one of the Coast Guard members at Prussia Cove saw her and believed her to be completely embayed, but she still did not signal for help or give any sign of distress. Everyone who had seen her progress across the bay agreed that she was being very poorly handled, and it looked as though her crew was extremely inexperienced. According to the sailor Giorgio Buffoni, the Meester van de Wal had been embayed and in trouble since 8 in the morning, but he did agree with the witnesses that they had not requested any assistance. As Captain Van Lemert and the crew tried to fight their way out of Mount Bay, the Mr. Van de Waal became more and more battered. She lost all of her sails other than her main topsail and parts of her bulwarks and stanchions. At around 8 at night, lightning had begun to flash, and then, as the storm properly blew in, the night became exceedingly dark, making it even harder for the people on the ship to see where they were. She began to ship large amounts of water, making it even more difficult for the captain and crew to manage her. At 3 in the morning, the Coast Guardman on watch at Poldhu raised the alarm in the village that he had seen a large bark dangerously near the cliffs. The rocket apparatus was gotten out, and the villagers mobilized for life-saving efforts, but they did not immediately see a wreck where the Coast Guardman had seen a large ship in distress. Since there was no lifeboat stationed in Mullyon, one had been approved in January of that year, but it had not yet been built. People from Poldhu continued down the coast towards Mullyon in their search for the distressed ship that had been seen. The search party had almost given up and decided that the Coast Guardman's eyes had been playing tricks on him, when one of the men, who was climbing along the tops of the cliffs, shouted that he had seen the wreck. All that could be immediately seen was some spars, broken boards, and some rigging on the rocks of Men Igrib Point. A moment later, a member of the search party also spotted the figure of a man, only half-dressed, climbing along the rocks near the wreckage. They shouted to him, and he seemed as though he was going to try to reach them, but there was a cliff between the group of would-be rescuers and the man. The rescuers eventually climbed down to the man and tried to find out what had happened, but it was found that the man, Buffani, spoke a mixture of Greek and Italian that none of them could understand, with very few words of English. He was also so bruised and battered that they decided that their first priority, before trying to question him, was to get him back to the village where they could feed him, clothe him, and get him medical attention. There was a concern that he had endured such an ordeal, and he might succumb to the experience without ever telling them what had happened. This turned out to not be much of a concern. Giorgio Buffani had only injured his right arm while climbing up the rocks of the cliff, and was otherwise only a little bruised. There was no danger to his life. Without a good explanation from Buffani about what had happened immediately forthcoming, the people on the coast were not even certain what nationality of ship they should report destroyed. Since Buffani was Greek, it was thought that maybe it was a Greek vessel, or, in consideration of the cargo that was starting to wash on shore, possibly Brazilian. Word was sent to Penzance of a shipwreck, and by 9 in the morning, the collector of customs had sent an officer to make notes about how the wreck lay and take charge of any cargo that came on shore. Lloyd's also dispatched an agent immediately. They could not help the most pressing matter, however, which was what ship had been wrecked, and who the people on board had been. Buffani, once he had been fed and clothed, still proved not to be very helpful. The Vicar of Mullyon was put in charge of getting as much information out of him as they could, no matter what it was. Buffani insisted, however, in spite of the ship having been at sea for about 140 days by the time that she was wrecked, that he did not know the name of the ship or the name of her captain, only that it was a Dutch vessel from Dordrecht. He was able to say that the ship had been washed onto the rocks of Meni Grib around 4 in the morning. When the ship had struck, there did not seem to be much hope left on board. Buffani reported that Captain Van Lemmerts had cried bitterly. He estimated that it had taken around 20 minutes for the ship to completely break apart. Buffani said that he and the other 2 sailors had been on the jib boom when the ship had struck, and that all 3 of them had leapt onto the cliff face. The other 2 sailors had been washed from the cliff face immediately by the waves. But Buffani had been able to hold on until the rescuers had found him. The final piece of information that he was willing to volunteer was that this had been his third shipwreck, and that each time he had been the only survivor. The vicar could not help but observe, with some slight suspicion, that in spite of being a common sailor, Buffani had on him a lady's gold pocket watch and chain, an unusual luxury on a sailor's pay. He did not mention the watch to Buffani, however, and the sailor also offered no comment on it. The female passengers had been on the stern portion of the vessel, which broke off and washed away with the screaming passengers still on it, while the remaining portion of the ship had dropped into deeper water. The stern was later found lodged between some rocks on the southern side of Poldu Cave. Near the stern were found the remains of 2 women, still in their nightdresses, and the remains of the third lady, a sailor, and the infant were found later on the same day. This allowed for the holding of an inquest which occurred 2 days after the wreck. They brought in an interpreter from Penzance to assist with Buffani's testimony. Buffani repeated that he did not know the name of the ship he had been on, or the name of the captain. A list was brought to him of Dutch East Indiamen in the hopes of jogging his memory, and he pointed to the Cosmopolite under the command of Captain Koenig. As soon as he had given his testimony, it was reported that Buffani made his bow and then completely disappeared. The inquest, meanwhile, on Buffani's evidence, brought a return of, quote, accidentally drowned. The inquest was barely over when the Dutch consul of Falmouth arrived, accompanied by the captains of 2 Dutch East Indiamen who were anchored at Falmouth at the time. One of the captains immediately asked if the ship that had been wrecked had been that of Captain Klaas van Lemmerts. On being told that it had been the Cosmopolite, he refused to believe it, saying that the Cosmopolite was not due for at least another 2 weeks. The ship that was expected was the one under the command of Captain van Lemmerts. The vicar then remembered a piece of flannel that had been picked up from the wreckage, with the initials KL on it, which only made the other captain more certain that he was correct. But the verdict of the inquest had already been returned under the ship name Cosmopolite, and the matter was therefore allowed to rest for the time being. Still, locals also questioned the time at which the wreck had occurred. If the wreck had occurred at 3 or 4 in the morning, the tide would have been out, but some of the wreckage and where the coffee was washing on shore suggested that it had been high tide, around 11 at night. That was also around when the vicar had heard a noise that he thought was someone shouting or crying. Was it possible that he had heard the actual time that the ship had wrecked? Considering how dark it was, the Coast Guardman could have easily been mistaken about what he had seen, especially since he had said a large vessel which hardly described the 650-ton bark. The matter of timing was never solved, but a week later, the Masonic diploma of Klaas van Lemmerts had washed on shore. And when the Dutch consul and the captain of the Indiaman visited the wreck site again, they were informed that they had been right. The ship was indeed the Jonkheer Meester van de Waal van Puttershoek, not the Cosmopolite. This helped in the identification of at least the passengers who had been found, and all of the remains were interred at the Mullyon graveyard. There would be further drama associated with the wreck. One of the women on board the ship had been widowed 9 years before, and had spent the past 20 years in India as a governess. She had accumulated some wealth and had written to her sister that she was returning home and by which ship. When her sister learned of the wreck, she inquired after her sister and was informed that she had been decently buried. When the box with the widow's money was fished up, it was expected that, after salvage costs, the money would all go to the woman's sister, only for a second claimant to show up. It turned out that the widow had not been a widow after all. The husband and wife had separated before she had departed for India, and her husband had disappeared and had therefore been presumed dead. But, with a small fortune on the line, he had reappeared. It was calculated that after the husband and the sister were done with a lengthy court battle over the money, there was very little of it left for either of them to enjoy. Meanwhile, it was claimed that the actual wife of Captain Van Lemmertz had offered £5 if anyone could find his remains, but that they were never found. The salvage of the tin went smoothly, but the people who salvaged the coffee lost money on their speculation. The coffee was in such salt-water-logged condition that it was beyond all salvage, and none of it was found to be drinkable. Soon all that was left of the Jonkheer Meester van Puttershoek was the local stories. Something about the whole incident left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. Why had Buffani not known the name of the ship or the captain he was sailing with? Why had he had a gold watch? Why had he been the only survivor of 3 shipwrecks? Why had he disappeared so quickly? Had he lied about when the shipwreck occurred? Was how badly the people on shore saw the Mr. Van de Waal sailing an indication of foul play and mutiny, rather than a bad crew? It was a mystery that was never solved, but author Arthur Quiller Couch would later say that some elements of the story had inspired parts of his book Dead Man's Rock. It was certainly a story sensational enough in its details to inspire a romantic mystery. For more information, please see Mullyon, Its History, Scenery, and Antiquities by Edmund George Harvey, published in 1875. Or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.